In this episode of the St. Philip Institute podcast, we're going to talk about the first stage in the spiritual life known as the Purgative Way or spiritual childhood. What does it look like? How do we know when we've entered the path of the Purgative Way? And what are we supposed to do when we're in spiritual childhood? Please enjoy. Welcome to the St. Philip Institute podcast, where we explore the sources of the Catholic faith, including the scriptures, the documents of the Church, the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, and the lives and witness of the saints. St. John Paul II often said, "Duc in altum," set out into deep waters. And our goal here at the podcast is to help you do just that. We don't want to merely provide you with information. Instead, we seek to help you achieve a true transformation and to respond to the Lord's call in your life to live out the universal call to holiness. Hi, welcome back to the St. Philip Institute podcast. My name is Luke Arredondo, and I'm the Director of Faith Formation here at the St. Philip Institute. So we are continuing this newer series looking at the spiritual life and then our life and prayer. So at the very beginning, I'm going to be talking about the phases or the ages or stages. There's all these different ways that it's used, but the phases or stages of the spiritual life, and then we'll eventually transition into talking about prayer. So the last episode was just an introduction to the general idea that the Church, in its saints and doctors and mystical writers, gives us a consistent vocabulary and a sort of a kind of a checklist for knowing where we are in the spiritual life. I think it's a common experience both for converts or new Catholics and adults who maybe want to get more serious about their faith to say, I want to do better, I want to pray more, I want to be more holy, but they feel like they're just kind of grasping and they don't even know what signs of progress are. In other areas of our life, when we're starting something new, or we have a new hobby or something that we want to get serious about, it's a little easier to know if we're doing better, if we're growing, if we're going in the right direction. So, for instance, if you start running and you can't run a half mile, and then after 6 months you can run a 5K and you feel fine and you're not hurt or anything. That's obviously you've made some progress. If you start lifting weights and the first time you go to bench press, the bar is all you can handle, and 6 months later you're bench pressing 100 pounds, you've made significant progress. In our spiritual life, we don't often have a sense of how to know that we're going in the right direction. And that's what spiritual theology can really help us with. And it's built on the witness and the experience of people like John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, great saints who were, really gifted in prayer and had a clear sense of what holiness looks like and how we get there. So this specific episode, we're going to talk about the first stage of the spiritual life, that's the Purgative Way, spiritual childhood. And I'm going to be following closely Garrigou-Lagrange's book, The Three Conversions or The Three Ways, different titles for it, and you can get a link to it in the notes for the episode. And the way that he describes the characteristics or the traits of those who are in spiritual childhood. So the first thing is you've got to go from a life of mortal sin to enter into spiritual childhood. In other words, you don't just by default become a spiritual child. Whether that means you're born and you need to be baptized, that's kind of the normal path, or maybe you were baptized as a child. Maybe you've received all of the sacraments that are appropriate to your state in life, but you really are still struggling with mortal sin. And that is kind of the key. So if you are trying to grow in your spiritual life, you're trying to get more holy, and you want to become a saint, and you just don't know how, and you are still actively wrestling with mortal sin. I mean, mortal sin is not a rare or infrequent thing for you, but it is kind of dominant in your life, and it may probably just one mortal sin. If you are in an active struggle of trying to escape mortal sin, basically you're trying to enter into spiritual childhood. So you're not even necessarily there yet. You have to have a conversion away from mortal sin. Doesn't have to be perfect, right? But I think this is kind of where most Catholics tend to be in their spiritual life. They know they're not supposed to sin mortally. They sometimes do, and then they go to confession, and they just hope that they can die sometime after they've gone to confession and before they've committed their next mortal sin. Now, that's not everybody. Certainly there are people who have moved away from mortal sin mostly. It's very rare, and maybe they still don't know anything about the spiritual life. But in general, the church, doctors and saints will show us that you have to convert away from mortal sin through either baptism or going to confession and enter a state of grace. You've got to be in a state of grace to be on the way of the purgative way, which is spiritual childhood. And there's, I'm going to read just a quote from Lagrange to give you a sense of kind of the way he describes it. So he says, "The first conversion is the transition from the state of sin to the state of grace, whether by baptism or, in the case of those who have lost their baptismal innocence, by contrition and sacramental absolution." So we have to do that first in order to begin our spiritual life. And then he talks about how this is like God digging into our soul, digging into the ground of our soul to plant the seed of faith. So he says later in this opening page, "For this purpose, by his grace, and by the trials to which he subjects the soul, he, as it were, God, as it were, tills the ground of the soul before sowing the divine seed within it. He drives the first furrow therein, a furrow upon which he will return later to dig more deeply still and to eradicate the weeds which remain, much like the vine tender does with the vine when it is already grown, to free it from all that may retard its development." So God is really the one responsible for allowing us to enter into spiritual childhood. And that's precisely what we talk about when we talk about baptism. It's this gift that we receive. It's something more than we deserve, nothing that we could ever earn, and it is given to us freely, right? And then if we have already been baptized and we have committed mortal sin, we go to confession and we are restored by grace. God is digging into our soul to plant a seed, but that seed has to grow. It has to be nurtured, has to be tended. So for instance, in the parable of the sower, there's 4 different types of soil on which the seeds, fall. Some land on the rock, some are snatched up right away. Some grow a little bit because they're on the rocks, but then the roots wither and nothing happens. Some grows up a little bit, but then it's choked by thorns and dies off. And then some is in good soil and it grows, right? So we're all given this opportunity to grow, being in the purgative way by having either received baptism or gone to confession. But then we have to be purified, and we have to go through purification, and we have to grow in the life of prayer. So in the first stage of the spiritual life, the purgative way, the purification is mostly going to be at a pretty basic level. It's purifying the senses. It's trying to stay away from mortal sin and even be conscious of when venial sin may be happening. It requires penance and mortification. And Lagrange talks about how in this first stage, the purgative way, we tend to think about God through the lens of creation. So we have a very sort of childlike view of who God is and even where we know God from. So our knowledge of God comes from, at this first stage, pretty much from creation. So we're at this very basic state of viewing things. He actually says it's creation and the parables that reveal to us who God is at this stage. The parables are really great. For instance, the parable of the prodigal son, where we learn about how God wants to forgive us, how we have been guilty of sin, but God wants to forgive us. He wants to offer us the robe and the ring and the sandals and have the banquet and all that. That's good, but it is a certain sort of beginning stage. So he says, in this state, there is a love of God proportionate to the soul's knowledge. Beginners who are truly generous love God with a holy fear of sin, which causes them to avoid mortal sin and even deliberate venial sin by mortifying their senses and concupiscence in its various forms. But notice that it's like, as a beginner, if you're very generous, and generosity is a big part of the way that Lagrange discusses this, and it comes from John of the Cross. If you're a generous beginner on the purgative way, you might be so inspired in your view of God that you want to avoid sin because of your love of God. Not because of fear of punishment, but because of your love of God. In this purgative way, this beginning stage, as I said, it's mortal sin that you're actively trying to avoid, and you're trying to become more aware of venial sin through penance, through mortification. And prayer at this stage is pretty elementary, pretty rudimentary. You are mainly leaning on vocal prayer, so the Our Father, the Hail Mary. Mass is a very big way of doing vocal prayer, and you should still be doing some meditation. So meditation is more prayer with the mind, where you think about God. So for instance, reading the story of the prodigal son and asking as you read it, pausing in silence, am I like this prodigal son? You know, am I like that? In what ways am I like that? How am I guilty of wanting to squander the inheritance that God the Father has given me, right? Or if you are, in fact, a father, right, like I am, you read the parable of the prodigal son, I can reflect on my own sense, on the way in which I am a sinner, I am like the prodigal son, but because I have children, I also can think about, am I being a father like this father? Am I offering mercy to my children? So mental prayer or meditation is thinking about God, thinking about who he is, about who we are in relation to him. And it's not so much vocal. You're not necessarily speaking to God, but you're thinking, and above all, in your heart, considering who God is and who we are. And there can be contemplation, but it's acquired contemplation. So Lagrange will talk about this distinction between actively pursuing contemplation, like I'm trying to contemplate, I want to do it. It's my will being involved, and I'm trying to get to a point where I can just gaze at God. Contemplation is a loving gaze at the Father, just looking at him. And little kids do this really great, and so give us sort of a model. You know, if you've got a toddler who maybe at the end of the day is just kind of a little bit tired. They're not necessarily, they don't want to go to sleep, because toddlers never want to go to sleep, but they're tired, and they might just come say, you know, sit in your lap and just kind of look at you. They're not asking you questions. They don't need you to do anything, and they're just kind of looking at you, and then they drift into sleep. It's super beautiful. As an adult, you can we need to acquire this loving gaze toward the Father. But when we are the one doing it, choosing to try and enter into contemplation, that's called acquired contemplation. Later, and we'll talk about this in another episode, in the unitive way, the third stage of the three stages of the spiritual life, contemplation is infused. It is just given to us. But that doesn't mean, and this is what I want to be clear about, in the purgative way, in your spiritual childhood, knowing full well you're still trying to combat mortal sin, that doesn't mean that like you're limited, you can only pray very simply the Our Father and the Hail Mary. Meditation should be a goal. Contemplation should be something you try to do, at least for a little bit. I want to read you just a little quote from, I think it's Teresa of Avila, about both the importance of vocal prayer and how meditation or contemplation is not, like forbidden here. So this is from Teresa of Avila. It may seem to anyone who doesn't know about the matter that vocal prayer doesn't go with contemplation. But I know that it does. Pardon me, but I want to say this. I know there are many persons who, while praying vocally, are raised by God to sublime contemplation without their striving for anything or understanding how. It is because of this that I insist so much upon your reciting your vocal prayer well. So, all right. How do you enter the purgative way? Through conversion from mortal sin, by baptism or confession. You then have to actively purify, especially your senses. The sins that you're dealing with in the purgative way are rudimentary, sort of elementary sins. There are a lot of sins of the senses and of the flesh, and we've got to do penance and mortification to purify ourselves. And of course, God's working with us, right? Most of the work here is God's, and a part of it is our even trying. The prayer of the purgative way is characterized by mostly vocal prayer, but with some meditation and some contemplation. The virtues that are proper to the purgative way, the first stage of the spiritual life, is the beginnings of all the virtues. So faith, hope, and love being given to us, and then us demonstrating some sort of basic act of faith, hope, and love toward others, beginning to grow in the moral virtues, temperance, prudence, justice, and fortitude, and then other virtues, chastity, patience, and humility. So the virtues are all present at every stage of the spiritual life, but in the purgative way, we're at the beginning of this process. And now, after you have started the purgative way, you've gone to confession, you're starting to stick with your prayer, you're trying to avoid your habits. You know, if you're wrestling with a particular sin, you avoid the people that draw you into that sin, you avoid the situations that draw you into that sin. Lagrange talks about how there is pain and suffering. Sometimes we're being pulled away from the things that cause us to sin, and if we let God do that, it may feel like a suffering, but it's ultimately for our good and for us to grow. But there's a sort of a danger here. And you see this in the Gospels, where someone begins on a spiritual journey, they begin to make progress, and then they get attention from Satan, and they get more temptation, and maybe they can fall away. But it's a necessary sort of battle. So Lagrange says this is talking about beginners, the purgative way, when they have been engaged for a certain time in this generous effort, they are usually rewarded by some sensible consolations in prayer or in the study of divine things, which is good, right? You begin to feel like, I'm getting something out of this prayer. I'm understanding the divine mystery better. I'm changing. But there is lurking right behind that a temptation. So listen to this from Garrigou-Lagrange. But what happens usually at this stage? Practically all beginners, when they receive these sensible consolations, take too much complacency in them. They regard them as though they were an end in themselves and not merely a means to higher things. They then become an obstacle to their progress. They are an occasion of spiritual greed, of curiosity in the things of God, and an unconscious pride which leads the recipient to talk about his favors and, under a pretext of doing good to others, to pose as masters in the spiritual life. And when that happens, when you present yourself as having a mastery in the spiritual life, when you are in fact a beginner, then the capital sins come up again. But John of the Cross says, and this is Lagrange is referring to John of the Cross here, says, the capital sins make their appearance no longer in their gross form, but in the order of spiritual things as obstacles to a true and solid piety. So the beginnings of the spiritual life are pretty simple, and I think probably going to be the most relatable to most people that listen to this podcast. And maybe some people are going to say, no, I'm way past that, and that's awesome. I didn't even know of these terms. I was in my 30s before I even heard that these things existed, and it's always a good reminder for me too to make sort of see where I'm at. Am I even in the purgative way? I hope I'm at least in the purgative way, but to just at least be aware of these are the kinds of things to look out for. So you have the entrance into the purgative way through a conversion. You're dealing with mortal sin, but you're trying very actively to move away from it. Penance, mortification, growth in the virtues, prayer, including meditation and contemplation. But then you will probably receive some sort of satisfaction that you're doing the right thing, and that's good. But don't let that become an obstacle in the form of pride. So, because when that happens, you then can see, you then are putting yourself in a position to fall away from the purgative way and then have to start back over. Even if you have to start over, I want to make sure this is clear throughout this whole series. Keep going. Keep going, start over again. That's absolutely what we're called to. But I think having this roadmap of what it looks like as you grow is really good. Really, really helpful. Okay. There's a talk about the different signs of suffering that you might have that I think is actually really good. So you begin, if you persist past that temptation to pose as a spiritual master, and maybe you're growing and you're sort of on the verge of entering into the what's called the illuminative way, you have to go through, maybe remember this transition, right? So just as there is sort of a puberty in our physical life from childhood entering into adolescence, the same thing happens as we're going to grow from the purgative way into the illuminative way, which is the second stage. And Lagrange says this is like God tilling the soil of our soul again, but this time he digs deeper. He wants to root out any sins as we enter into the illuminative way. And what it looks like when you are in the dark night, which, to be clear, the dark night of the senses will precede entrance into the second stage. But it means for a while you were going to confession, you were dealing with your mortal sin, you're stepping away from it, and things are going good. You're not falling into your old habits. You're praying more, you're trying to do meditation and trying to enter into contemplation to gaze on God, right? You have grown in the virtues. You feel progress. Then suddenly prayer starts getting harder again. It feels like maybe I'm not really making any progress and I don't know what's going on. It's hard. I want to be holy. I want to be closer to God like I recently was, but I don't feel the same way. This is the dark night of the senses. We are losing our sensible or affective sort of rewards. So prayer initially feels good, and then it starts to I don't know if I'm getting anything out of this. A very, very crude analogy, right? But if you're exercising and at the very beginning you're sore, and then you suddenly are not so sore anymore, and you think I'm doing good, and then you push it and you do more, and then you're like, oh, I'm sore again. I thought that was only at the beginning, right? So you enter into this suffering where you don't feel anything in prayer. It feels like you're just wasting your time. It's difficult to get through. You still have this strong desire for God. You want to be close to Him, but you can't figure out why you don't feel that way. And then, especially that if you have more inclination to just be with God, then it's a good sign. So Lagrange puts it this way. If, along with this intense desire for God, which I've talked about a little bit, there is an added difficulty in praying according to the discursive method, that means talking and thinking and using your own ideas and words, and an inclination towards prayer of simple regard with love, this is the third sign that the second conversion is in progress. Now, what he notes here is that actually quite a lot of souls don't make it out of this dark night of the senses. And it's really, I think, interesting to me the way that he discusses it, that God clearly wants us all to grow more and more holy, but He will not let a soul advance from this purgative way into the illuminative way if they are not ready for it, if they're not ready to accept the suffering and the difficulties that they're going to endure. Then they need more time. They need more growth. And so he says there's a sense of sort of like arrested development where people get through the first conversion, they enter into the purgative way, they're making progress, but then when they encounter the suffering that will come, they shy away from it, or they actually fall into the pride of I've mastered the spiritual life, let me tell you other people about it. And that is as far as they go. So clearly the call for all of us is to proceed through this, but being aware of it, I think, is a big part of knowing that this is a sort of thing to expect. So when we are aware of this and we begin to experience these sufferings and we remain faithful to the prayers, to meditation and trying to enter into contemplation, we're being good with our spiritual direction, we're going to confession, we're doing the things we're supposed to, we can get past this and enter into a more deeper form of union that is the illuminative way, which we will talk about in the next episode. So this is just, again, quickly, a little bit of a treatment of the first stage of 3 stages in the spiritual life, the purgative way. And probably a lot of you will identify with a lot of this stuff. It doesn't mean that it's a waste of time to learn about the other forms of the spiritual life, the other stages, but it is also good to just kind of be honest with yourself about, like, where am I? Does this describe you? Does it describe me? Or, am I not even there yet? I mean, this is not meant, and I don't want it to come across this way, not meant to beat you up and say, oh, you probably haven't even started a spiritual life yet. Rather, it's to show you, look at all of the guidance that the church gives us and recognizing where we are in our spiritual life. We just did a series recently on confirmation, and I talked a lot about the link between being a disciple and truly following Jesus as a response to the graces we receive in confirmation. And that is absolutely going to require wrestling with some of this stuff about the spiritual life, seeing where we are, knowing where to go. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Just look at spiritual childhood, which is the purgative way. And if you really want to dig deep into it, I would recommend Garrigou-Lagrange's book, The 3 Conversions, or The 3 Ways of the Spiritual Life. There's different titles. As I said, I'll give you a link to it in the description below so you can find it. It's very cheap. You can also find it. It's very old. You can find some copies, just the text online. So you could start reading it right away. It's very, very helpful and very clear. Just kind of lays out the logic of it. And he time and time again will say, look, this is not some mystery that we absolutely can't understand. It's logical that God would put us through these phases of development. And later in the book, in other parts in the book, he talks about how we see the apostles go through these phases of development, and the church in a certain way goes through. So it's kind of it's sort of all over the place, but maybe we don't know, and so we don't see it. So again, hope this has been helpful to you, and I look forward to the next episode where we will talk about the second age or second stage, the illuminative way. Thanks.